This lecture then is medieval Europe 500 to 1500 before, was it 63 minutes or something like that, so we don't have that much time. It's important that we do this though, so that when I say medieval Europe, you know all of the basics, you know, you're aware of not just the general chronological parameters, but we have the same vocabulary, more or less. If I say monastic writers, that we know what monastic writers are. If I say, oh, these were typical scholars or scholastics or schoolmen, you'll know generally what I'm kind of referring to. But more than that, also an umbrella, so that you understand some of the big themes in this period that relate to the sins. But more than that, obviously, for you as humans who move on from this college to go elsewhere, I just think it's really important that you all have some brush with the Middle Ages. So if this is your only brush, if you're a visitor and you never come again, then this is it. I have to do my best job to introduce to you the Middle Ages, and I'm going to try and do it in that time. Medieval Europe. 500 to 1500. Why 500 to 1500? Well, it's convenient, obviously. What happens around about the year 500 that means we might start a new era of European life? What's that key word?
Reformation?
That would refer to the 1500, definitely. So once again, you're one step ahead. But the 500...
The end of Roman Empire.
Exactly. Generally speaking, medieval Europe begins when the Roman Empire ends. Huge problem. If you live in Greece or in Turkey, the Roman Empire doesn't end. It's still the Roman Empire. You know, it's now all run from Byzantium, which becomes Constantinople, which becomes Istanbul, but it's still the Roman Empire. They still call themselves the Romans. It's a bit of a problem already. Like all aspects of history, you know, the layers just multiply and multiply. But okay, the Roman Empire ends, in all intents and purposes, in Western Europe, in England, in France, in Spain, in Italy. It collapses, okay, and it's replaced by new kingdoms, new forms of life, new forms that I will not talk about now, but which we sometimes call the barbarians, or the Goths, or the Visigoths, or the Lombards, all of these people who came from beyond the realm of the Roman Empire, from Germany, but also from Denmark and Sweden and other places. They come down, the hordes of barbarians, they take over lands that were previously under Roman administration. In England, my country, it's the Anglo-Saxons, the people from that little neck of like where Germany leads into Denmark, the Angles and the Saxons from a bit lower, they come, and the Jutes from a bit higher, they come over and form the new kingdom. It's now an Anglo-Saxon kingdom, which becomes Angland, England, which is why we have Anglia or England. So this is the barbarian world. This is the post-Roman world. The Lombards come and colonize the north of Italy, hence Lombardy. The Visigoths come to Spain, and the Vandals too. So it's a convenient way to refer to a post-Roman world. I'm fascinated by this post-Roman world because it is a huge transformation. Where you had roads and aqueducts and taxes, you no longer have, in some cases, roads, aqueducts, or any taxes. You no longer have an economy in some places. There are stories of people digging up graves, right? They dig up the dead because there are plates buried in there and they've got nothing to eat their dinner on. This is the post-Roman apocalypse, basically, in some parts of Europe. All right? Entire economies collapse. Entire ways of life collapse. It's in that fall that medieval Europe begins. Now, 500, obviously, it's vague. And there are other things that characterize this period other than Rome. It also generally coincides with Christianity, with the arrival and spread of Christianity throughout Europe. Western Europe predominantly, and Northern Europe predominantly. And 1500, obviously, as you mentioned, the Reformation represents the enormous split in Christianity that happens around about that time. 1517. There are loads of other ways of dividing it. Some people like to say that the Middle Ages ends with printing, the beginning of the printing press, because then suddenly thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of readers and people engaging with knowledge that had never done so before. Protestantism, print, the discovery of America, the discovery, unquote, quote unquote, of unquote unquote America in 1492 and beyond. So there are lots of different ways to frame it, but I'm generally talking about the 1,000 years between Rome and between Protestantism and the end of a Christian era. Okay, it is an era of extraordinary creativity. It's an era of extraordinary innovation in terms of institutions, ways of living, ways of thinking. It's called the Middle Ages, which is sad because it was christened that by Petrarch, actually the Italian poet, just before Dante. He said, well, between the great time of Roman civilization, between Rome and between what's coming now, this Renaissance, this rebirth of Rome, there's this sort of middle period that was, where we weren't quite so great. And so that's what we call it medieval. Medieval is from media evum, middle age. It's just Middle Ages is the only word that we have for this. Dark Ages is another, but that's not so popular, maybe for obvious reasons. It's a time of great innovation and creativity, though. Why bother studying the Middle Ages? Well, if you're interested in origins, the beginnings of things that we enjoy now, then I think the Middle Ages is a good time to study. The university, like the one we're all in now, is a medieval invention. There's a reason why universities today try to look like Gothic medieval buildings, because that was the first model in Bologna, but also in Oxford and Paris and other places. It is, of course, the beginning of Parliament, which is important in political history. Parliamentary, not democracy necessarily, but parliamentary governmental life. That is the meeting of different representatives to discuss political affairs and to form compromises. That is a medieval formation. Let's see, the law as it exists, as it binds people together, as it brings justice and order in a country apparently like England, which it still does, I think. This is a medieval invention, the common law. The idea that if someone dispossesses your land, there will be justice. Some authority will save you from some angry guy with an axe. This is a 12th century phenomenon. Love, as I mentioned earlier, you may not believe it, but the concept of love that we have is a medieval one. The idea that through love you transcend to something beyond the self. This is a classic medieval invention. There are more things I could say. It's an exuberant period. The reason I say all that is to recognise that this, although you might imagine, or we might imagine, that the Middle Ages is a time of great tradition and conservatism, that things stayed the same. Petrarch wanted us to think that all things stayed the same, in this middle period, that there was a great ancient civilization of Rome, and then there's this, nothing, sameness, rebirth. It is not. It is a period of dynamic change. It is a period of great invention, as I say. And we're going to explore some of that invention just now. The first thing we need to talk about then is Christianity. And just to make this stuff crystal clear. Who is Christian? When are they Christian? What does it mean to say that this is a Christian world that they live in? It all goes back to St. Paul, really, insofar as there is the spread of Christianity in Europe. His letters to the Romans being a good example of his evangelism. I'm not going to talk about Paul in too much detail. I know some of you have studied classes on the history of the Bible or on Christianity. But obviously, Paul begins that evangelism that spreads Christianity in a very fundamental and important way. And his becomes the model for how Christianity spreads evangelically. Here is the earliest image of him. In around about 500 CE, this is the Christian situation. As you can see, things aren't entirely joined up, but there is Christianity radiating around the Mediterranean. By the year 500, also, we have the west of England, Scotland and Ireland, but not yet this barbaric part here. Notice that it's fairly fragmented. Of course, Christianity radiates from Jerusalem. Of course, it is a cult. There is an initial church of Jerusalem, but this actually falls apart fairly fast with a big political struggle that happens in the first century. But generally speaking, it then moves to Egypt, Alexandria there, and down the Nile. It moves up to Asia Minor, Turkey. Of course, Paul himself, St. Paul, was modern-day Turkish. from Tarsus, and Greece. It radiates from this area. It spreads then onwards to Rome and Carthage, Tunisia, Algeria, these places here, up Spain, France, and around. So 500, it is spreading. It is not a virus, of course, it's an idea, it's a way of life, but it is spreading throughout the kind of, and you can see it spreads on the kind of trade routes. It's a Mediterranean spread with a couple of notable exceptions. By the year 1000, this is the picture. There are a few major changes there, as you can see. If I just keep snapping back and forth. Enormous gains here in a region that is semi-familiar to us. Not quite by 1000 gains here. Lithuania, incidentally, is the last pagan holdout in Europe. The last place that is no monotheistic religion. It's not Islamic, it's not Christian, it's not anything, it's pagan, so it's something. It's the last holdout into the 1300s. Spain, as you can see, has stopped being Christian. Parts of North Africa and Egypt here, the Levant, have stopped being Christian by the year 1000. This has to do with, of course, the rise of Islam, which spreads from Arabia across the Mediterranean network and threatens to destroy or to supersede, shall we say, Christian life in this period. So Spain is part of that story. The other thing to notice about this big shift, and I suppose the most important thing to notice for our purposes, is how unified it has become by now. Like, look at all these independent churches, the Arian Church itself, Celtic Christianity, Church of the East, these non-federated branches of Christianity. In the early period, 500, there's a lot of those. There is not one yet hegemonic Christian culture, but by the year 1000, more or less, I know I say that word a lot, or not word, that combination, more or less, I have said it a few times, it's more or less true that there is a federation of Christianity. The more or less is important because, of course, things are always more complicated than these simple maps make out. But still, things are fairly solid here. We do have an emerging. There's actually a difference in shade, which isn't coming out well here. But we have different seas. We have like an Eastern Church emerging and a Western Church, with Rome as the centre of one and Constantinople as the other. But generally speaking, we have something like a universal Christian culture which emerges in much of Europe. And that is to say that they are on the same page, more or less. That they are engaged with the same texts, this of course being the Bible, but also the theologians who precede them. People who get education are doing so in a similar way throughout. And what eventually happens by 1100, 1200, is we find there is one common language for all learning, for all intellectual life across this continent, this half of the continent, and that is Latin. It is the lingua franca. We think it's very modern now, and it's great that we're in a Russian university, and I say it's great, is it? But it's great that we're all doing this in English, right? That there is a common language which allows people who are not, from the same place to study in the same way. This is not new. Latin was just like this in the Middle Ages. People came from Scotland, from the south of Italy, from North Africa, from Lithuania almost, and they all studied in Latin. Anyone who did medicine did it in Latin. Anyone who did arts and poetry did it in Latin. Anyone who did theology did it in Latin. It is like English is today, it was then. And this allows us, this is the key part, this does allow us to some extent to study medieval Europe in some commonality. We don't have to keep saying, this is a Spanish idea, this is a very English idea, this is a very Italian one. There is a common discussion. Like the way Evagrius Ponticus, I think, was from a very different place to John Cassian, and they were in different languages as well, but they were engaged on the same issue. They both actually did work in Greek initially. So it's that commonality that allows us to study this place as a whole, and allows us to study the sins as a conversation across a continent. A Christian world. This is the important caveat, guys. Yes, okay. The continent has turned Christian, but this is obviously one partial view of how this world existed. Might think about the world. Obviously, this would be the most modern representation of the world. we're aware of its situatedness in space. That concerns us. We want to represent it accurately geographically. That concerns us. This is the medieval world. This is a map of the world made in around about the year 1200. This particular map actually was destroyed during the Second World War, sadly. But this is a copy of that map that was made, and it survives. The interesting thing about the way the world is imagined, broadly speaking, in this period, 500 to 1500, is the priority in it. What is at the centre of this world? What is at the centre of this world? Any ideas? Jerusalem, yes, excellent. Okay, so actually, loads of you were aware. Jerusalem is at the centre of this world. Jerusalem, the beginning of all three monotheistic religions, right? Or not the beginning of, but central in all three monotheistic religions, holds a central place. So Jerusalem is at the centre. You can vaguely, I think you can work out this is Europe here. It's a T and O map, so it's in a T shape more or less. Europe here, Africa here, Asia here. It maps the history of the world onto the geography of the world. So we have the Garden of Eden here with Adam and Eve, and we have the rivers described in the Bible. The Nile should be over here. The thing is, and I think I made this point maybe in a lecture before, but the imagination is that it is a huge world that they live in, but there is a trajectory to it. There is an end point. That it is a world populated by people that are not Christian as well. They do accept that. Okay, the world is full of, by now, Muslims. It's also full of Jews, and it's full of heretics and people who've never heard the gospel. But the point is that it all has a direction, and that's kind of symbolized here. Here is Christ's head, Jesus' head at the top of the map, and you can just about make out his hands and his feet at the bottom and either side. The idea is that the whole world is Jesus' body at some level. That no matter where in the world you are, or where in world history you are, or whether you've heard of God and Jesus or not, you're still part, unfortunately, if you don't like it, of the story of Christianity, of the story of Christ, of the story of salvation from a Christian point of view. There may not be all Christians in the world, but all of the world is part of Christian history in this period. But there are Jewish people, of course, who live and mix in these communities. It's interesting to read the 7 deadly sins in antagonism against other communities. The Jewish community is one of them. You can see that stereotypes about Judaism, money, and sort of noses like this originate in the Middle Ages. And we can talk about that when we talk about envy. This kind of sort of disgusting propaganda exists in the Middle Ages. Muslims, and of course relations with non-Christians become really important in different parts of Europe. If you're reading a Spanish text about the 7 deadly sins, there is engagement in Spain with the Muslim population. They are under crescent and cross, as we say. There is a syncretist society in which Christians are coexisting with Muslims. Of course, they're coexisting with Jews as well in different ways. There are also obviously crusades in which these differences are played out in a violent way. And these all relate to the sins. But the important thing to note is that there is community relationship going on. We should never lose sight of the fact that it's a Christian society, and we're reading Christian authors who are trying to tell us that it's always a Christian story from start to finish. But people's ordinary lives are not always universally Christian. There are many, many people who have daily interactions with, sympathy for, engagement with non-Christianity. And we should bear that in mind when we look at the psychology of sin, if we can. There are the Mongols too, and it's a little bit from global history here, but there are moments where these clashes with non-Christians become apocalyptic. One of them is the Crusades, right? Christians going to the Middle East to try and defeat Islam in some great cosmic battle for Jerusalem. But then there's the stuff that the Christians didn't want, which is forced upon them, and the Mongols is a great example. There's this one moment of great diplomacy where 2 monks go on foot to try and persuade the great Khan, to become Christian, and the mockery is enormous. The Khan says, well, you want me to join your little cult on the edge of the world, but my empire rises in one part of the world and sets in the other. The sun never sets on my empire, he almost says. So surely God favours, if he favours anyone, he favours me. So no, it's a great piece of diplomacy. It's a great exchange of letters. These brushes are important. They're more than brushes, as I say. They shape people's conception of what the world is, where humanity is headed. And we do see times when to be non-Christian is to sin in some way, or they see it as some kind of predisposition to sin, like, Jewish people are more given to lust or whatever, or avarice. These things come into play. This dialogue or non-dialogue with other religions is crucial and will frame much of our analysis. Searching for God, looking for God. Okay, look, you know by now, and I'm sure that when you signed up for this course, you had a good idea that this was going to be a Christian-centric course. That is to say, we are studying the ideas of sin in a particular culture, and that culture is Christianity. There's a theological basis to that. We are interested in theological ideas of the soul. Not necessarily just psychological, but also we're trying to understand theology as a way of understanding the human, which is to say, the theological categories we mentioned earlier, like seeing all activity through God. All things are only things to us insofar as God is part of them. This is, as I said earlier, a theological language. So I hope this is not too terrifying for you, but we're interested in things from a theological point of view through a lot of this class. The searching for God in the Middle Ages is an important activity of a lot of the people who write the texts we're going to read. A lot of monks, a lot of theologians who are, some of them explicitly, their whole lives are about trying to find God in their lives, trying to have a mystical experience, trying to see the face of God, or maybe just trying to let God into their lives in different ways. This is St. Anthony in the desert. This is, like I mentioned earlier, the earliest history of Christian monasticism, of going into a monastery and trying to find God by living in solitude or a small community away from the world, begins with St. Anthony. There's always an important demonic element in this. It's like you're in the desert and you're looking for God, but the devil is also there. Demons are also there trying to tempt you. And St. Anthony is a good example of that. He's tempted by devils and demons, certainly in the life that's written, but eventually embraced by a vision of Jesus. They're not popular anymore, monastic buildings. Monasteries become a really important way of life, okay? So it's hard for us to understand this maybe, but they become a really popular choice for young people, like a really good life decision. Like even not just from a religious perspective, but basically from a profession perspective. Like if I were a careers advisor in the year 1200, I might say to you, Nikolai, the best thing you can do, Nikita, the best thing you can do is, join a Cistercian monastery. It's your best bet. And we need to understand that. These institutions become, as I say, they begin in the desert. The very first monks, the very first monks, they go off into little rock monasteries in the desert and they live alone. There's one guy, Simeon the Stylite. Has anyone heard of this guy, Simeon the Stylite? Oh, he's my favourite. He lived on a column for 40 years. He stood on a pillar. I think, how big was it? Not much bigger than this kind of space here in this corner. And he stood there and he lived there for 40 years. He never came down. There was a plumbing system, in case you're wondering how they discovered that. This column still exists, but it's been worn away. It's like a lollipop that's been or an ice cream. It's been worn down. It's now only like this big because people have been touching it and looking at it and, I don't know, doing the other things on it for, 1,000 years. Simeon the Stylite, classic early monk. I'm going to live in solitude. I'm going to do something spectacular. These first guys were called athletes or ascetics. The ascetic, A-S-C, it comes from the same root as athlete, okay, which is to say they are warriors. They are athletes. They're training their body and mind to be perfect people, and they're going to do it on this column. There was a guy called David Blaine who tried to do basically the same thing, this magician in the modern world. I remember he was in London in a box, and he sat in this box demonstrating that it was possible to just live in a glass box suspended by a crane for 40 days. And everyone sat underneath him eating bacon sandwiches and mocking him, which was really cruel. But it shows us that we don't see this as athletes. We don't see people like that as an athlete anymore. Sadly, the public sees this as kind of stupid or bonkers. But anyway, it still exists, but not really, it's fringe. But anyway, those were the first monks. Later on, we get more developments like this. This is Fountains Abbey in Yorkshire in England. This is a monastery. This is like the high end of monasteries. They become really advanced communal buildings with kitchens and cafeterias and, warm rooms where you can all go and stand and be warm. They had those. They must have been horribly cold. I've been to this one, and I've just never been colder in my life, and even Siberia has nothing on. Cold stone in Yorkshire on a wet day is horrible. But anyway, these buildings, they're popular choices. Okay, so why would you join one? Well, obviously, you decide you want to devote your life to finding God. But it's more than that. Okay, so there are some downsides. So you can never have sex or, have a family or, live any kind of career. That's all gone. So that's the downside. But on the plus side, there's the warm room. The other things are, the plus side, I suppose, is it's a stable living condition. At a time when there is trouble with resources, there are, maybe you're the third son of a farming family and your older brother is going to inherit, and your second brother, well, they've put something aside for him, but you're the third. What other choices do you have, guys? What other choices do you have? You could go and work for cash, possibly as a farm labourer somewhere else. You could try and find another career in the priesthood, but that's difficult to fund. And how do you get the education? Joining a monastery, it's a safe bet. Guaranteed roof over your head, guaranteed hot meals most of the time. If you're really sick, you can eat meat. That's one of the provisions. And it's a job. And they'll give you an education. I suppose I mock it a little bit, but there's another element to it. For as much as there are, these places are stuffed with people who had nothing else to do. I promise that, unfortunately, there are some of those. But there are also, for every one of those, there are committed young people, women as well as men, women in separate monastic buildings, nunneries, convents. But they're committed young people who just really want to do something away from society. They don't want to join the rat race. They want to drop out. Maybe take a new angle on things, think a lot, deeply about the world they're in, not join the commercial struggle to be the best, but try and become a better human. That is a genuine appeal, that carries an appeal. And as I said earlier, it's hard to empathise, but maybe the hippie movement of the 1960s and 70s is one, people who decided to go and live on communes. Maybe rock and roll is another in a weird way, like people who want to drop out of society, take a different angle and approach, do something which is just odd, eccentric. Monasteries become popular, and it's something like, I have not got the exact statistic, but at some point it's like something like 7% or more of young men are in these monasteries. So like almost 1 in 10 young men decide to join these monasteries. That's huge. That's more than study. What is it? More than study IT, isn't it? Or something like that at university. So it's really popular. As popular as IT is. This is like one of the strange... This is a representation of what? Something from the sea attacking someone. This is a representation of a mystical experience.
Is this octopus?
Yes, it does look like an octopus. A 5-legged, maybe the other 3 legs are behind. It looks like a squid or an octopus. This is Hildegard of Bingen, who we're going to read in the Pride Week. This is her representation of the mystical experience, of like a mystical fire, which, does it descend from above on the person, or does it arise from within the person and ascend? I don't know. That's a good distinction. This is the end goal for some monks of their life's work. The end goal is in this life to ascend to a mystical union with God. What does that mean? Well, you mentioned earlier substances, and this is interesting. But the surrendering of the brain over to some other power. The idea that a mystical experience, I suppose, is it's more than just some fluke of magic. It's not like you take a pill and then, you see the universe and it's beautiful. Of course, it's not that. That would be the opposite of this, arguably. This is about training the mind and body so much that you eventually come to some kind of union with God in your mind, temporarily, a mystical experience. It's difficult to describe, but and it's often seen. Bernard of Clairvaux, who I mentioned earlier, we don't know if he ever achieved this himself. I think he did. But he claimed it's like a droplet of water being dissolved in wine, or maybe it's a droplet of wine being dissolved in water. But the point is, like, your own mind becomes one with the bigger source. So let's say a drop of water becoming absorbed in a big pool of water. Forget the wine for now. That single drop, it was an individual entity. It had its own shape, its own mass. Maybe it's a big drop, maybe it's a small drop. It came from somewhere. Now, when it drops in, it subsumes. It is indistinguishable from the thing it becomes, right? It drops into it, it is indistinguishable from the substance. This is the best metaphor for this mystical experience. Monks, why do they all shave their hair in the same way? Why do they all get rid of their clothes and all wear the same thing? Why do they all get up at the same time of day and go to bed at the same time, say prayers at the same 12 times of the day? Arguably, right, they are trying to do this. They're trying to stop being a droplet of water and start being part of a mass of water. This is the idea. We sometimes call it the annihilation of self. The annihilation of self, but this may mislead us. It is also the perfection of self. The perfection of self in God. This is what Hildegard is talking about. She has all these visions in her Scivias. She's obviously one of the great, she is one of the great female writers in the Middle Ages. She is totally unique in her scope. She's a 12th century writer. She writes on medicine. She writes on mystical visions. She writes theology. She writes her own style of Latin. She's amazing. She had these visions. She writes about Lucifer, and we'll read that next week or on Saturday, or whenever it is. But anyway, she describes that she has like this vision of the cosmic egg or something like this radiant egg which appears in the sky.
Maybe it was psychosis.
You know, this is interesting. This could be a paper. It might have been psychosis. But whatever it is, she understood it in the framework exactly the same as the 7 deadly sins. You purge yourself and purify yourself to the degree that you, paradoxically, you're no longer yourself. You blend with God. But also, it's a paradox because you also become the best possible self. You know, what is it? It's like, what is the perfect stone, the perfect brick? It's the one that fits perfectly with all the others. It's still a brick. It's still a perfect brick. But it's part of a whole. I don't know. This metaphor is impossible, and it's a paradox that's impossible. But anyway, this is a journey that I thought I would alert you to because it frames a lot of the discussion of the sins. To purge yourself of the 7 deadly sins, like Dante does, right? Dante, when he makes his way all the way up the terrace, you know, and the angels sing when anyone moves from one terrace to another after their 1,000 years of staring at the floor or being stuffed with smoke, right? They are in a process of purifying themselves so that they can become part of God, right? In this process of absorption. They still remain themselves, but I think Dante has a beautiful line about it. They become translucent. They become themselves, but also God through themselves. A complicated process. We will discuss it more. Right, let's get more realistic now. Let's get more practical. Any questions about that whole monastic, mystical, water into wine business before we move on?
What is the difference between this monastic life in church and the like a political church? Was it possible to, for example, become pope through the monk life? Like a career plan?
Look, this is a great question for loads of reasons. One of them is it really anticipates what's coming next, which is like, it's almost like I told you to ask this question. But it's a serious point. So you've got these guys, and there's always a tension in Christianity between the church as it exists as an establishment, right, with priests and ordinary people like us who go to the priest, and the priest tells us what we're doing wrong, what we're doing right, how we can become better people, right? We live in a society, and yet we're Christians in this model. There's a tension between that and then the monks. Who are these monks? Right? They're just ordinary people who go off and live. They take a vow, right? They say, I promise to be obedient, but they're not priests. They haven't gone through special training. They can't administer the sacraments. They can't marry you. Like if two of you wanted to get married, a monk could not do it because he's not got the special ordination. He hasn't been ordained. He hasn't passed the tests, basically. So there's always this tension, and you can see it as like the institutional establishment church and then the monastic one. And it's a real problem. There are many monks who become great bishops and popes, and there are a few popes, only a few, and there are many great bishops who then leave it all and become monks. There's someone like Frederick II, the wonder of the world, the most horrifying emperor of them all. He, on his last days, puts on, or I think just as he's dying, puts on the Cistercian habit, becomes a monk for the last 20 minutes of his life. He wants to be so perfect for the last 20 minutes. So there's a lot of crossover. I'll give you one example because I'm obviously fixated on this topic. It comes to the time around about Dante, actually, 1295, 1294, what is it, 1293? I forget the exact date in the 90s of the 1200s. They decide, you know what, we've had lots of popes who are, they've been trained at universities, they're big shots. Why don't we choose one of the weirdos who lives alone in a monastery? I say weirdos, it's not fair. I'm talking about someone extremely pure and ascetic. And they chose this guy who became Pope Celestine V. And they said, right, actually, it's time for an angelic pope, someone who's so pure that they spent their whole life basically living on a column. He'd lived at the top of a mountain in a little cave. And they chose him as pope, and it was a disaster. It was so, because you know what he did? He built a little monastery inside the Vatican. It wasn't the Vatican, it was another. He kind of like simulated everything that he was used to. Small, hard bed, not seeing anyone, and he did it all from there. And then this is a really weird story, and there's no time to tell it, but I'll tell it anyway, which is his rival, who became Pope Boniface VIII, the story goes that he drilled a hole, or someone he knew drilled a hole in the wall and whispered, "It's God, resign, resign," and this is the story. And Celestine resigned, and he was the last Pope to resign before Pope Benedict XVI. So, apparently. So, I mean, look, great story, strange story. Good example of this tension, though. And like Dante was obsessed with this issue. Because Boniface, he puts right in hell. Boniface is not yet dead in the Inferno, but there's a character who says, he's head down in the flames, and he's saying, is that you, Boniface? You're coming. I know you're coming. Dante hated Boniface, but he also hated Celestine. He put him in limbo of hell, because he said, he called him the great, it's basically sloth, Acadia, didn't have the will, couldn't do it, wasn't up to the challenge, called him a coward, put him in hell. So Dante is a real great judge of all these people. Anyway, good story. Sorry, slightly sidetracked. The first part of your question was, let's talk about that tension. So as much as Christianity is this great cosmic journey of the individual, and lots of people choose to be monks and go off and live lives in search of God in small communities, there's also obviously an establishment. There is what we might call an empire of the papacy, which is the Pope in Rome. He is the most important figure in this period in terms of setting policy, if you like, for the church, but also lots of other things. I suppose he's the administrative centre. Of course, he hires and fires cardinals and is influential in choosing bishops and things like that. It is a real empire by the end of this era. What is their role, these popes? Of course, they start crusades, they start wars. Eventually, popes have their own armies. The Pope begins just as Bishop of Rome. He's just one man who is the head of a church in a city, which is Rome. But by this period, the Pope becomes like an emperor of all the world by like the 1300s. In this period here, in the late 11th century, the 1060s and 70s, there's this big clash. And the Pope starts to say that he should have the most power. The king or an emperor is subordinate to his authority on all sorts of issues. And they have this big showdown. It's too complicated to go into. But basically, it is about who has the symbolic power to invest. So if you're a new bishop, right, you've just been made a bishop, you've got a lot of control, you've got an enormous palace all of your own, you're in charge of the mental and moral well-being of everyone in Jimin. Right?
Sounds like pride.
Yeah, it sounds like pride. It is pride, right? A lot of bishops are in Dante's hell for that reason. Who gives you the right to be that bishop? Who is the one who says, I now make you bishop, congratulations? But more, who puts the oil? Who pours the oil onto your head? This is not social distancing. Who pours the oil onto your head? Who gives you the ring, gives you the staff? This was all very important in medieval ceremony. Should it be the Pope? Should it be the king? And it was this big battle, and it never went away. And people were killed, like Archbishop Thomas Becket, over this issue. It was a really big struggle. It kind of begins here in Canossa. By the time of Pope Innocent III, he is the most powerful of the medieval popes. this has gone to the next level. By now, the Pope declares himself to be vicar of Rome, right? Which is to say that he is the successor of St. Peter. And this is very important. He has his authority because Peter was Jesus' first disciple. Peter has bequeathed his legacy to this man, the Pope, Bishop of Rome. But by now, Innocent almost calls himself Lord of the world as well. There's this global sense. He calls all of these crusades, right, we've got to convert those Lithuanians. They're still pagans. They've got to become Christian. We've got to have another crusade against Islam. We've got to have crusades against heretics. We've got to start expanding Christianity in every direction. This guy starts that in a big, big way. And this is Francis of Assisi, who we will talk about another time as well, who's also part of this struggle. So by the kind of the year 1215, the early 1200s, the Pope is a really important figure, claiming to represent almost a Christian army. If you're a Christian, you're all part of an army together. You're all part of fellowship together, no matter where you're from, and you've got one leader on earth, and it's the Pope by now. The important thing is it's more than just about politics. It's also about you and me, ordinary people, and how we relate to our own moral lives. It's this Pope who says everyone must take confession once a year. You all must do it. It's this Pope who says every single priest must be well trained, and we need to retrain them. In other words, right, under the popes, all of our lives, all of European life was to be managed and controlled from the centre. This is not such an unfamiliar concept. It's a very modern concept. Centralisation of power, capillary effects of one central power. That's Pope Innocent III. And by the time we get Boniface, this is the guy that Dante wants to plunge into fire head first. Boniface VIII. He actually died, it gets really silly. He actually dies because he's slapped in the face very hard and then he goes to his bed and dies from the shock like 7 days later. We shouldn't laugh. Poor Boniface. But that was a struggle. It's like Boniface, he issued this statement called Unum Sanctum, which is basically the effective statement that he is more than just a pope. He's also in command of all aspects of your life. Justice. Boniface would extend Christian justice to all of everything. So everything that existed, all conflicts should have a Christian element, and the Pope should be the highest authority of all of that. He thought he was more powerful than the emperors. He got a slap, and he learned from his pride.
It was heart attack.
Yeah, we're not sure. We know that there's some time in bed, so I don't know. It can't have been maybe a blood clot from the bruise. No, we don't know. His successor, John the 22nd, I haven't got a slide on, went slightly further. By the time that Dante is writing, by the time Dante dies, you have a pope who claims he is also the emperor. That the emperor dies, and John the 22nd says, well, I as pope should also do the work of the Holy Roman Emperor. That big struggle about king and pope, which is always there, by the end of our period, the popes are trying to be both. And if you're interested in the Reformation, it's precisely this kind of episode which is remembered in the Reformation as why they need secular churches, why you need a separate English church, why you don't need a pope, because it's an all-powerful empire and it's an evil empire and, it needs to be fought. It was not lost on people like Dante. Dante saw these popes, by and large, as part of an evil empire too, but then Dante has his own issues as well. Guys, any questions about popes? I'm aware that this has been a long series of lectures and that I've been talking for a bloody long time. But I'm scared that if I stop, that the camera will be upset. But guys, questions at this point? You must have questions about these popes or this church. Not everybody believed, Not everyone really cared.
What happened to those who didn't?
Well, mostly nothing. Mostly those who didn't believe or didn't care were absolutely fine. They went on with their ordinary lives. And, the only time we find out about people who don't care, we find these really interesting snapshots. There's this trial, this court case in the south of France, in a place called Montaillou. because apparently there were loads of heretics there who believed that the world was made by Satan and God created the heavens, and that all of life is a struggle between the material, which was made by Satan, and our souls, which is godly. And like, you should be a vegetarian because those are really human souls trapped in animal bodies. It's pretty weird, but not fish for some reason. Interesting stuff, interesting beliefs. The reason there's a trial is that they're heretics. And yes, eventually some people are burnt at a stake for believing this stuff. It's not quite as brutal. No, obviously it's brutal being burnt at the stake. But I mean, it's not like they were really keen to burn some people just to show. Like, if you were going to get burnt at the stake, you really had to go through. You were given lots of opportunities to say, are you sure you want to be burnt at the stake? There's still an option to recant. Later, we have torture and other stuff. As a medievalist, I'm keen to say that most of that is after 1500. Thank you very much. And is, witches, for example, the Malleus Maleficarum is 1490s. So, it's, for me, I say that's after. Yeah. But the point is, but through these trial records, right, we see how ordinary people reacted. Now, it came under the microscope because someone chose to persecute these guys. Someone chose to say, all right, let's round up all the heretics in the south of France and inquisit them and then maybe burn a few of them just to let everyone know, But mostly, it sounds horrible, I know, and it is horrible, let's face it. But that doesn't mean this wasn't happening all over the place. It's just they chose this target. Now, in these records, we see, like, awful encounters, let's be fair. Like, the one that sticks out to me, and again, this is horrible, but it's a man who, like, comes into a barn and, like, starts to force himself on a woman. And she says, stop it, we're not married. And he says, oh, come on, it feels good, doesn't it? And he says, and if it feels good, that means God likes it. Because he says, because God would want us to feel good, because God is good. And anyway, it's a classic example of what, I don't know, people just manipulating other people and claiming it's about God. People just doing what they believe. People basically making up their own beliefs in their head. That obviously happens. Like Innocent III, this guy really didn't want, of course, that's the end of what he wanted. The absolute opposite. He tried to make it so everyone was informed. Everyone knew what was the right thing according to the Bible. Because, and if we're on his side, we'll say, well, he really believes that people are going to be sucked down into an icy pit for 10 billion years if they get it wrong. So, arguably, right, he really does care about every individual soul. Arguably, as well, he's the president of an institution, and it's in his interest to make sure that institution functions, and that there isn't a rival institution of people who believe that God believes in good things and therefore do what you like, and which was coming. There was perhaps a possibility that there would be rival churches, rival Christianities, and Pope Innocent and people like that had to act to cut off as he saw it, as the cancer. But anyway, long story. The short version of it is, people were much like us, guys. They were not different from us. They had the same doubts that we would have confronted with this stuff. When they're confronted with a picture of Lucifer in the bottom of some ice underneath Jerusalem, they had some thoughts like you would, well, how come no one's ever been there properly? Why isn't it on the map? Why can't I visit? Is it really there? They had these same questions. Our challenge is to understand it beyond a scientific modern skepticism to what it could mean in all levels of the human heart and mind, Different metaphors, different possibilities for framing our knowledge.
So there is some movement or institution who was fighting against this trend?
Against, the established church?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are, the Cathars are the most commonly cited. This is a series of heretics who, as I say, believe that heaven was created by God and the earth by Satan. Are they established? We don't know. The only things we know about the Cathars are written by their enemies. They were destroyed. So, if you want to be a bit of a conspiracy theorist, fun internet sleuth, you can find all sorts of websites that suggest the Cathars still exist and they were always something more strong. It's an interesting counter-history. In reality, the Protestant Reformation shows what happens if there isn't a strong attempt. It's the splintering of the church. It may not be that people were worried, popes were worried that there would be rivals who would claim, I can give you a different form of moral perfection. I can give you the real answers to the questions you want to know about the universe. It might be that they believe that exactly what would happen, would happen, which is that the church would fragment and there'd be no authority anymore. There'd be a Baptist church which has its own leaders. There'd be a Calvinist church which has its own leaders. And they'd all claim to be the true church, which is exactly what happened in the Reformation, more or less.
So basically there were two great powers in that time, like kings and the pope, and basically they legitimized each other's power.
Yes,
and,
exactly right.
Yeah, I understood how the pope legitimized the power of kings, by all these rituals and religious stuff, but how kings legitimized the pope's power by the participation in these crusades and because I mean it's kind of politics and each monarch want to have like his own pope, he's in his own interest, and the interest of kings could be different, and it's interesting for me how this battles happened and what was the weapon of kings who influenced on the election of the pope.
Oh, really good question, and you predict exactly what happens. So sometimes you get who's going to be the new pope? Well, you're the king of France and you really want this guy because it's useful to you and you know that he's going to go along with some of your wishes, and you're the king, you're the emperor and you want this guy, and then we have an election and we have an anti-pope and a pope. It might happen with the US election, we never know. We might have an anti-president and a president, I hope not. But you get that situation where it's a split and some people are loyal to one, some people are loyal to the other. The anti-popes are an interesting history in themselves. What's in it for a king? Oh, it's kind of obvious, right? If you're the pope and I support you, it's great for me because let's say there are rival kings, but do they have the pope on their side? It's great. There's some other authority which you can rely upon. This is a classic struggle in German history. The German king is always king of Germany, but also Holy Roman Emperor. It's really complicated. There is no Germany, right, basically. There's a region. And it's always a struggle. How can you prove that you're both king of the Germans, the Teutonic king, and emperor? We have to go to Rome and have the Pope put the oil on your head before your rivals do it, and then you've won. And that's kind of how it works, sort of. I hope that answers your question. I'm going to answer that in a different way in a second when I talk about feudalism really quickly. Okay, intellectual life. I'm not going to talk about this very long. I already said that that there's a medieval origin to universities. This is Cambridge, University in the UK. Cambridge actually formed out of Oxford. The way they say the rib of Adam was taken and made Eve? This is kind of right. The rib of Oxford made Cambridge. There was a fight in Oxford, a brawl, someone died, and they had to close down Oxford University, and all of these scholars went to Cambridge, a similar enough town, equidistant from London or whatever, and set up a university. Anyway, these are medieval institutions, of course. There's not much to say that I haven't already kind of touched upon. We will look at universities from time to time. We will look at scholars who exist entirely in universities. You probably know, I'm sure, intuitively you have guessed that being a theologian is the top of the tree and that all study kind of pertains towards knowledge of God. That doesn't mean you can't study medicine. They do study medicine. Doesn't mean you can't study law. They do study law. The first university is a law university, Bologna, in Italy. But theology is kind of at the top of the tree. And all of the theologians have been through the other arts. They've been through the arts of grammar, rhetoric, logic. They've been through astronomy, astrology, which one? No, astronomy, mathematics, music, and geometry. They've been through the liberal arts, much like you guys, and then they majored, but they all have to write a theology thesis. It's like if you were at SAS, you did all the classes, but then you have to write the thesis in theology. That's kind of a bit how it works. Just going to say something really brief. In case any of you were interested in what is the relationship between all of this and, for example, Plato, Aristotle, ancient thought, non-Christian thought, it's an interesting question because they will be absorbed into the seven deadly sins discussions at times, particularly Plato, I think, and Aristotle, actually. Well, let's look at Thomas Aquinas here. This is the greatest, probably, I would say, in readers' polls, best intellectual in the Middle Ages. It's Thomas Aquinas. He wrote millions of words in his lifetime. we call it the medieval computer sometimes. He tried to answer every single question there was through pure theology. A question like, when your body is resurrected from the grave to go to heaven, do all of your fingernails come back too? It's a good question. They were part of your body. Do they not count? And then what about the other stuff? What about the other stuff? Does that all come back? The hair, the other stuff. Anyway, Thomas answers questions like that through theology. He also asks, does God exist? He's got a great answer to that. Of course, he says yes. Although the first half of his answer is no, and then he proves himself wrong. So anyway, this is Thomas. You see, here's his learning coming down, and Jesus is at the top, okay? So he can study all of the scriptures and all the books and all of the authors, but it's Jesus who's at the top of this. Weird, Jesus never wrote anything in his life, from what I gather. Jesus is not really considered an intellectual figure. Some strange tensions here. Francis of Assisi would have a lot to say about this. Francis of Assisi would disapprove of this model of Jesus is the chief of learning. He would suggest something more like Thomas belongs over here in a para institution, and really what Jesus is the key to understanding is the good life, which is embodied, which is not intellectual. Marianne.
This is really interesting because it kind of subscribes to the idea that you cannot be credited for your mind, right?
You cannot be
Credited.
Oh yeah, the pride idea, yes. Yes, exactly. All knowledge insofar as it is knowledge comes from here. But this is still a very big Thomas in the start, in the middle. I believe it says this little bit says, everything there is, all the words are digested in my gut. I don't know what it means. He did digest a lot of words. But anyway, if we zoom in a little bit here, you'll see that these are some of the sacred writers, okay, and they are named, and they are pouring knowledge into Thomas's book, which is Omnia, everything. But we also have, you can't read this, but that's Aristotle there, and this is Plato over there. So they are also reflecting into, but also we have down here, Islamic philosophy is here embodied. I believe it's Averroes, the philosopher, who Thomas uses loads in the Summa Theologica. He's read everything that Averroes has to say about Aristotle. He calls Averroes simply the philosopher. That's really high praise. But don't worry, from a Christian point of view, he's crushed and lying on the ground because Thomas has all of learning, which is, of course, all of Christian learning, which synthesizes everything. The pagans, Aristotle and Plato, Islamic philosophy, it synthesizes it all and then crushes it and tends towards Jesus. It's a very strange model of knowledge, but it's one that we should bear in mind, okay? All things pertain towards the divine. All knowledge contributes towards a Christian totalitarian knowledge of the universe and the human. And there he is again. Community, one brief word. This is Bruegel, the ordinary person who is a medieval Christian, who is a medieval person trying to deal with their sins. We don't have much evidence of their lives. This is the tragedy of a class like this. We're going to learn a lot about what scholars tell us and monks tell us, and all kinds of mystical and fantastical writers tell us about the sins, but we really don't understand that much, except these few interesting court cases, about how ordinary people dealt with their sins or thought about it. Dante's poem was written for ordinary people to understand. It was written in the vernacular, in his local dialect. It's not written in Latin. So that does teach us something, right? That this is accessible to some degree. This is kind of an image of medieval life that we must try and fight with. That basically everyone is getting on with ordinary life and ignoring the stuff that's going on in monasteries and schools and universities. It's probably as true as it is today. It's not much different. There is a lot of dissemination. There are a lot of preachers who try to transmit messages of high theology, ideas of the sins, like what we said, like pride and the complex issue of pride that we discussed. Is it different from arrogance? These are things, in theory at least, that are being discussed with ordinary people like this. In the marketplace, there are preachers who stand there and explain this stuff in ordinary language. They tell stories which are accessible and interesting, and there's nothing else to do, guys. You can't go home to Netflix. Okay, so this is. But more seriously, the world of story itself is one in which these ideas are being communicated to a popular audience. This is another image. This is more like the ideal image of Christian community. Everyone following perfectly their place in the ideal city. We'll talk about the ramification for the sins on community soon, but we're coming basically to the end, and this silly sequence at the end was supposed to explain to you how feudalism works. So the last thing is because this word comes up a lot, okay? And it's sometimes interchangeable with medieval. And it kind of comes onto your question, Nikita, about how medieval society works. Okay, this is feudalism then, in hopefully less than 3 minutes. What is medieval politics? What does it look like? Can anyone tell me what feudalism means? Before
I can, but I don't know what is it in English.
Okay.
Probably I can try.
Okay, go.
We have some major like king or like someone who is ruling,
Yeah.
and he has, or probably only he has
mostly.
vassals, I guess it's the same.
Vassals, yeah.
Vassals, yeah. And all this small piece of lands are the vassals of the king, and they're kind of separate and kind of independent, but still in the case of war or in the case of like very need, the king could like just ask his vassals to help him, and the vassals cannot like deny this suggestion in a way, and yeah, it's how feudalism works to me.
Perfect. Okay, this was really good. Now we're going to hear exactly that, but with images. That was a really good...
Game of Thrones.
Yes, Game of Thrones. This probably gives you some idea. Okay, so feudalism, vassalage, agreement. The mafia is often used as an analogy. Okay, really briefly, okay, you have a king. You have a figure who is the key political figure. This is from the wonderful Lewis Chessmen. Here's the king. Okay, so how does it operate? Of course, he is invested. He has some symbols of power, which themselves are curious. Crowns, imperial crowns, orb and with cross on it. You know, his power is usually seen as deriving from somewhere. Okay, it's got some legitimacy. He's not just the strongest guy who defeated all the others, although usually in practice that is it. But, you know, there's like, but also he has this charism, this sense that he's blessed and that he has legitimacy in the Christian world. Okay, so usually there are vassals, as you say. This is complicated, but essentially there are a group of people, nobles, who owe their loyalty to this king. They agree to defend the king in military terms, in return for the king's support. It's kind of a trust, a bond of trust. So, for example, like, you know, the king might have land. Quite often it might say, right, I give you, Dimitri, I'm going to give you, you know, all of Wales. You're going to have Wales. It's a lot. But, you know, but the condition, of course, is you remember if anything happens. You know, where it came from, who gave you Wales. So in simple terms, it can work like that. In more complicated terms, it's like, Dimitri, I'm going to allow your children to go to Oxford, and you know, but in return, you have to remember it's not as good as Wales, but it's still pretty good. It's your key into the establishment. Or sometimes it's usually not the Oxford carrot stick. That's much more modern corruption, actually. But it could be anything. It could be just allowing your some favour. Anyway, vassals who agree, and they're usually large landholders, right? Large landholders who own vast quantities of property. And of course, the Middle Ages is full of these guys rebelling against the king. Yes, it is. Of course it is. That's all that ever happens. And yes, they're symbols of wealth. Castles, enormous castles, often of the divine kind, like this. Look at that. Horses, very expensive things. It's very expensive to be one of these high aristocrats. It's very expensive to be a knight. Then there's this power institution of the bishops. This is where some tension comes in. Bishops are also major landholders. I might say to you, Dimitri, in return for your loyalty, I want you to be the Bishop of Norwich, which would be huge. It's the other side of the country. You'd have to leave Wales and go all the way to Norwich, East Anglia. But anyway, that can happen too. Or it's often more covert, like, I would like Dimitri to be the Bishop of Norwich, and I'm telling you, the other bishops, that that's what I want, and then you elect him anyway, right? You know, so there's pressure politics. Bishops are important political actors in themselves. They take taxes from other people, they get taxes from their population. They live in palaces. Sometimes they fight in wars. They have their own army. But they, of course, answer to a different And of course here, there are the cathedrals that they sit in, and the croziers, which symbolize that they are shepherds of the people. But they have their alternative, the cardinals, they have an alternative bond, of course, which is the Pope, their alternative allegiance. And there's always this tension. Do I, as a bishop, listen to the king, or do I listen to the Pope? Normally they get on okay, but someone like Archbishop Thomas Becket of Canterbury is caught in the crossfire and tells the king outright, my loyalty is not to you, it's to the Pope. You cannot judge anything that happens in my church. Thomas was, it's too complicated, but he ends up being decapitated in Canterbury Cathedral just after Christmas in 1170. So that was kind of the end of that one. And that set a precedent. There was a lot of fear about that in the following years, obviously. Then there are the knights. These guys are obviously interconnected in some way. These are the more humble people, knights. They're people not quite like us, maybe slightly more, with enough money to buy all the horses, and maybe that's us, I don't know. Enough money to buy the horses and the swords and the helmets and all the other things that are really expensive. These guys are, usually vassals of higher aristocrats, or sometimes vassals of bishops. And it's quite simple. Okay, so you're a knight. You can have some privileges from me, the high aristocrat. You can have, and I can even give you some money to buy your horses. I can allow you to stay in my castle. But in return, you must protect. You must protect us if we're ever invaded. So the knights...
It's like an offer that you can refuse.
Most of the time, yeah, let's face it. I mean, you don't have a choice. And that's what we call bastard feudalism, which is just brute force. You don't have a choice, and it's horrible. We're not going to talk about it. And then who's underneath all of these? Of course, the horrible grey mass of the rest of us. The pawns. The simple people who can be bashed around as we like. Generally speaking, this is 90%, 95% of the medieval world, and we don't know anything about them. We do, of course, know lots about lots of them, but the majority are just blank pawns in the history books, and that's sad. It's very, very sad. I actually think that studying the 7 deadly sins is one way to access the lives of ordinary people, because this is something they all knew about. It was on the church walls, as we know. It was in the little books that they were taught to look at and read from in confession. The 7 deadly sins is one way into understanding a psychology which is not just high psychology, but also the ordinary psychology, the ordinary engagement of usual people like ourselves, usual people, the pawns of medieval life. So that's the end of the lecture. Just a couple of questions to leave us with, and they're the things we're going to be doing over the next few weeks. How did life in the Western Middle Ages work? By the end of this class, I hope you're going to know pretty good. You're going to be able to speak for, a solid 44 minutes about the Middle Ages to every friend you ever meet. Okay, and you're going to be able to do it perfectly. All right, I think you're going to do it. I think you are. The thing about the Middle Ages is this. It's not quite what you think, it's this. You're going to be able to do that forever and ever and ever. How can a study of the 7 deadly sins help us understand medieval approaches to? This is our goal. By the end, I'd love us to be able to have re-understood these 6 things, right? And maybe you could just choose one of them and focus on it in your project. But helps us to understand better medieval approaches to politics. Like pride, for example, is a classic case. You understand how pride works. You understand some of the political, ethical judgments that are made. Religious community, human nature. What is a human being? We have a different conception now from then. Studying the sins can help us understand what human nature was for ordinary medieval people, how they conceive themselves as humans. Is to be a human to be an agent? Is it to be a puppet of God? Is it to be a person with a destiny? All of those sorts of things. Philosophy, of course, medieval philosophy we're going to get to the heart of, And medieval philosophy is not cut off from, as I say, it is part of the Greek tradition. Plato, Aristotle, everything you know from great books. Medieval philosophy is part of that tradition, and we're going to through the sins we can understand better some of the unique medieval philosophical ideas. The sciences, we will talk about melancholia, depression, through the perspective of the sciences as well as the arts, and then art as well. This class there will be lots of images, and we will decode them as well. And I hope that a lot of you in your projects will do art history too. As you know, historians try to be omnivores, but I want you to be as wide-ranging in your source base as you can. All right, I hope that's, yes, a blank slide. Great, it's over. Thank you very much, guys. It was a very long session. Thank you. And look forward to our seminar, which is on Thursday? Thursday? Friday?